What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Today, Mike and I are incredibly excited to be joined by Dr. Eric Helms and Dr. Cliff Harvey once again. How are you guys doing today?
Better
Pretty
now that I'm
good.
on.
Yeah.
Well,
Now
we're
that I'm on
very
with Eric, it's all
happy
come
to have you
together.
here. Eric, by the way, are you in New Zealand right now? Is that what I was?
Yeah, Cliff and I are 20 minutes away from each other by walk. So, yeah,
Oh, that's awesome. Very convenient. What time is it there, by the way?
just after 10 a.m.
Now, Monday morning? It's the day ahead
on a
of it.
Monday morning.
Oh,
Yes, and
wow.
I can tell you the future's bright, gentlemen.
Well, very happy to hear that. So without further ado, let's dive right into it, shall we? So I think we would all agree that protein takes the priority when we're setting our calorie intake or macronutrient guidelines when we're talking about contest preparation. So further subsequent details may not matter as much as long as we're equating for calories. And so while this is generally true, we'd like to kind of dive into the nuances that can make one approach a little bit better than another, at least on paper when we talk about it. So, Eric, for your general approach in our podcast with Cliff previously, he kind of talked about how he wouldn't go below 30% of calories from fat, and kind of mentioned that you might be partial to setting fat to a minimum threshold in order to maximize your carbohydrate intake. Can you confirm or deny that claim?
Yeah. I think it would do myself disservice if I just said yes, although I could, because I think we have to remember that the context in which someone presents information is always needs to be discussed here. So I'm literally a bodybuilding and physique and strength athlete researcher, right? So a lot of the times when I'm giving information out, I'm specifically thinking in mind to someone who might be going through contest prep while trying to maintain bodybuilding resistance training performance and getting on stage at minimal levels of body fat and um, ex- accepting that there is some element of quote unquote robbing Peter to pay Paul to get into that stage condition, that something has to be suboptimal. I think if you were just to take that at face value as me as a strength and conditioning researcher, then you'd be like, well, that's not optimal. And I would say, of course not. Um, because getting on stage with striated glutes is like pointless unless your goal is to get on stage with striated glutes, right? You know, there's no reason to do that. It's physiologically suppressive to performance, mental performance, relationship performance, life performance, in all ways. So I think in the context where I have talked about pushing fat down to as low as 0.5 grams per kg for a limited time period to get to this, a very difficult to reach conditioning level is in the context of substantial metabolic adaptation. So reductions in total energy expenditure, to the point where you need to create a deficit when someone is already lean, already fatigued, and recognizing that we're probably still on also a low carbohydrate diet at that point. If we're going to go to that low level of fats in an absolute sense, or relative sense, I should say, to their body weight, it means that I don't feel comfortable picking on carbohydrate. And I don't feel comfortable doing more cardio either. So it means that other avenues for generating a deficit may be worse. I might have to have a higher interest loan to Peter or Paul, if you were going to keep that analogy in that scenario, than me taking fat down for a temporary period. So short answer, yes. Long answer is depends on the context. I don't like to go on a low-fat diet if I don't have to, but if necessary in certain contexts, I would.
So let's explore that a little bit further. And yes, when it comes to contest prep, you got to get lean enough. Something has to give. And for you, it does seem like you're comfortable with giving in regards to fat intake. So what is the advantage here in your mind to keeping fat at bay rather than carbohydrates?
Great question. I think we need to think about not what's the advantage, but what's the least disadvantageous thing to do. So when you look at the research on low carbohydrate diets in resistance training, we have a important gap, which is the reason why we can even have this podcast and why there's a debate to be had. Scientific debate among good faith actors who actually are well read always occurs at the limits of what we know, right? So if we simply had a handful of RCTs on bodybuilders following either low carb or low fat diets, there wouldn't be a debate. I would just be telling you the results, and so would Cliff.
There would still
we
be
don't
a
have
debate.
that. Probably, of course, but probably not among good scientists, right?
Yeah.
It would be on Instagram. So what we have is we have observational studies watching what bodybuilders do and looking at outcomes, which is great for looking at associations and observations. What we have is mechanistic data, which is actually quite nuanced, which we're going to get into, looking at low carbohydrate diets, the combination of low carbohydrate and low energy diets, and low carb or high carb in and out of an energy balance deficit as well. Looking at performance and also looking at body comp change. And then we have a lot of general population data on weight loss when you use either high or low carb or high or low fat approaches. What we do not have are these RCTs on bodybuilders. So when you collectively look at all that information, one of the things that I have seen is that when you ad libitum ketogenic diets in the context of resistance training, things typically go well. Performance doesn't go down, body composition improves, people typically drop without attempting to achieve a deficit, or at least the researcher's not imposing a deficit. People will drop body fat, maintain lean body mass, maintain or improve performance, and then it kind of levels out. And that probably has to do with some appetite regulation occurring. When you look at some of the research on ketogenic diets, even in the context of having high protein, there's a couple of data points that show ketogenic diets are more satiating, which is kind of neat. But it doesn't have a lasting effect. So it kind of is one tool to potentially create a new normal of just walking around slightly leaner. However, when you look specifically at low carbohydrate diets in resistance trained individuals where they also institute a fairly substantial deficit, that's when things don't go great. So for example, 1988, Wahlberg and colleagues instituted a 40% deficit in recreational trained bodybuilders. One group was then consuming 40% carbohydrate. The other group was consuming 60% carbohydrate with high or low protein. Now, those both sound like reasonably high carbohydrate intakes. But when you've already got a 40% calorie deficit, the group consuming 40% of those calories from carbohydrates is a pretty low carbohydrate diet. And you saw in the group consuming lower carbohydrates and also lower protein, but also higher protein, to accomplish that higher protein diet, you saw a decrement in their bodybuilding performance. So their ability to perform volume went down. And there are a few other comparable studies where you see that. But
they held muscle equally effectively. It was the performance metric which changed.
That's a tough one in that one because we're also looking at the change in protein. So the higher protein diet, and it's only 2 weeks as well. So there was a higher protein component and a lower carb component to reach that higher protein. So it was either moderate carb, high protein, or it was high carb, low protein. And you saw the lower protein lost muscle but maintained performance. I wonder how long that would last for, because if you can't sufficiently perform resistance training volume over time, that's probably going to have a larger impact, arguably, on muscle mass retention over time. But this is a 2-week study, right?
Yeah.
And there are other acute studies on that. Like if you actually glycogen deplete someone, they will perform poorly. But I think that is an interesting question. If you looked at the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s research, and eventually I'm going to let someone else talk, I swear to God.
It's too much to unpick here.
The assumption that if you go on a low carbohydrate diet, you will be glycogen depleted is actually false. The body is remarkably good. If you look at some of the recent research by Volek at maintaining glycogen levels in the face of changing macronutrient distributions, which is kind of neat. I think that's cool. However, that may not be true when there's actually an energy shortfall, which makes sense. You have to have something else, even if you're really good at converting, glycerol backbones and converting lactate to other stuff, So overall, if you summarize the research looking at low carbohydrate diets overall, and then the performance that's relevant to, say, a bodybuilder or someone doing resistance training, you see that the issue of glycogen only becomes a problem if you're in a deficit performing training that would reasonably deplete glycogen to some degree and on a low carbohydrate diet in most cases. So I think that can be avoided with an intelligent application of low carbs, but at a certain stage in a contest prep diet, there's only so much you can manipulate. Like if you only got 120 grams of carbs and you're like an 80 or 90 kilo competitor, it's really difficult to like manipulate that in such a way to maintain performance. So that in those cases, I prefer to chop fat down. It might increase their or decrease satiety. It might, have some longer term effects, but it does take a while for some of the effects to manifest if we're talking about, vitamin deficiencies for fat soluble vitamins, et cetera, stuff like that.
Fantastic. So, Eric, it was really important that we had you give out your general position and clarify some things, considering we did have Cliff on previously to kind of detail his approach. But now, Cliff, here's your opportunity to unpack some of that, things you disagree with. So Eric stated that, for certain periods of time, he's willing to go down to 0.5 grams of fat per kg. From what you've said in the past, it seems like you might disagree with that. So do us a favor, kind of restate your general position for this discussion, and then, your counterpoints to some of the things that Eric said.
Yeah, so I guess the overriding thing is that I would probably just have a slightly higher threshold that I would start from. And I would probably give the lipid intake a bit more primacy than, say, carbohydrate intake. So in reality, it's a difference in the method we're using. But it's not as different as you'd think. So basically, as I talked about last time, I would generally apply protein first, and I would look at that based on what the outcome the athlete wants to achieve. So we would basically try and optimize protein first and foremost. Then I would look at the relative sort of metabolic status, the relative insulin resistance of the athlete, and then I would manipulate lipids based on that first. Let's say they're a highly insulin sensitive athlete and their metabolic markers look fantastic. I might start at 30%. So by that point, we've got our protein covered off, we've got our lipids set at 30%, and then whatever's left, I'll provide in carbohydrate, because I have that idea that, it's this carb-appropriate idea whereby carbohydrate is to some degree activity dependent. That's going to be determined by how much someone's outputting, and then how much that actually means in absolute amounts is related to how much we've already had to allocate for, say, protein and fat. So that's basically the starting point. But there's a couple of nuances within that. Number one, if we're going down to 0.5 grams per kilo body weight, that may not be that far from 30% in a calorie restricted state. So I would sort of look at that, and I typically have a lower threshold, again, as a starting point, because there's fluidity around it, of maybe a gram or so of fat per kilo body weight per day, or more accurately, actually, a gram of fat per kilo lean body mass per day. So now we're getting a little bit closer to what Eric was suggesting anyway. So really, I think I'm starting at a point where my baseline would be a little bit higher. Some athletes, I think, certainly thrive on a much higher carbohydrate amount, and therefore they don't need that amount of lipids. One of the things that I'll throw in there, though, is that one of the big reasons that I'm looking at preserving a certain lipid intake is predominantly to help provide for that resilience to hormonal dysfunction, and particularly in the female athlete, but also in the male. Now, I need to walk that back a little bit as well, because I think that there certainly has been enough research now where we would say there's a trend towards a higher fat intake being associated with more robust hormone profiles, better androgen profiles, higher testosterone, and in the female athlete spectrum, certainly resistance to anovulation and better luteinizing hormone pulsatility, things like that. So basically, when we're looking at female challenges there, they're certainly benefited by a higher fat intake. But around a normal sort of dietary prescription, is the change incredibly meaningful? And I'd say it's probably not. But typically, most of that research tends to indicate that standard dietary average of around 30-odd% is pretty good for preserving hormone balance. So I think one of the reasons why I put that in as a starting point is because it's kind of the known factor. We know that can help that resilience. We don't always know exactly at what point that hormonal resilience will plummet. Because as Eric suggested, I just don't think we've got enough research there to really say, well, if you're taking in less than this amount, that's going to be really negative for sort of medium to long-term health. Because a big aspect of what I do, obviously, is to look at the foundation for performance being health, first and foremost. And I want my athletes to be resilient, where they can come back and compete year after year and all that kind of stuff. I will say, though, within that, Eric's in the trenches all the time on this particular topic, whereas I don't work a lot with bodybuilders anymore. I obviously have a lot in the past. Now I would tend to, if I'm talking about weight restricted athletes or people who need to be really lean, it would be more so working with fighters. So that would be a slightly different situation too. I'm not going to ramble on for too long, but I did want to make a couple of points around what Eric was saying with respect to the glycogen depletion side of things. And I'm actually going to support his position a little bit here, because when we're talking about that preservation of glycogen status and, the ability for people following low carb to replete glycogen just as efficiently as another athlete following a higher carb paradigm, we need to consider that that's probably only ever been demonstrated, like the faster study, in relatively long-term fat-adapted athletes. So I would say that probably doesn't apply if you're a habitually high-carb bodybuilder. Switching to low carb to try and get lean and expecting to preserve glycogen, it's probably not going to be the same situation, because you simply haven't developed the ability to replete glycogen as well in the face of low carb. So that probably provides another dynamic too, whereby if you are habitually low carb, then you may not really need to preserve that glycogen and that carb intake in order to have those benefits that Eric was talking about. However, if contextually that's where you're at, you probably don't benefit from going low carb to the same degree. And I think that also plays into something that we had discussed earlier, where, we'll often see that there are somewhat societal, cultural influences on this, where I certainly see bodybuilders in the US are more inclined to be higher carb than a lot of the bodybuilders that I've worked with in New Zealand, Australia, who tend to have a little bit more of a low carb focus. Now, that's probably just because there's a greater proportion of low carb advocates down here. I'm not sure. But in that context, where you have more people following a higher carb approach that works, if they were to switch to a low carb approach, maybe it wouldn't work so well because they need that time to adaptation. Whereas other people following a lower carb strategy habitually, well, that's, going to obviously offer them those benefits whereby maybe they don't need the carbs to satisfy performance in the same way that another athlete would. Overall, I will summarize by saying that I think the effect size between these different diets is actually relatively small. And then we need to really start delving more into the psychosocial aspects of nutrition, the behavioral stuff, and maybe getting a little bit more nuanced as we go on, looking at how that results in long-term outcomes for different people in terms of hormonal health or maybe metabolic status in the long term. Take that, Eric.
Oh, knockout punch right there. I'm still recovering. Just general response from me, or is there any specific questions?
I think we can move into the next question here. And Cliff, you touched a little bit on insulin sensitivity there and its potential impact. Eric, does the fact that bodybuilders tend to be, some of the most insulin sensitive people on the planet, does that play any role in your recommendation to maximize carbohydrate intake during dieting states?
Absolutely, because the like when bodybuilders, man, if anyone has ever been to a seminar where this question has come up, they can see me either do an eye roll or try to suppress it, because there is this bodybuilders are trying to optimize everything, which is totally fine. But they often look to overturn stones that don't need to be turned over. I think what bodybuilders forget is that because of the training they do, I'm not saying there are no insulin-resistant bodybuilders. Of course there are, with certain genetic outliers or like Masters 2 or Masters 3 competitors, et cetera, or people who struggle to get into condition, or get very heavy in the off season because of their, relationship with food and then start a diet, et cetera. But in most cases, if you are reasonably lean, which even in the off season bodybuilders are, performing a ton of resistance training, and then starting to do cardio, eating a relatively high fiber, moderate carb, healthy diet overall with lots of phytonutrients and good stuff like that, you are going to be incredibly insulin sensitive, like you said. So I think what bodybuilders forget is sometimes they want to optimize everything, even if it provides 1% more. But what they forget is that the things they do make the territory for what could be considered optimal expand. It's not just like, oh, well, I know I'm in the range of insulin sensitive, but if that's a spectrum, maybe I'm not super insulin sensitive. Therefore, should I have 340 grams versus 380 grams of carbohydrates? And it just doesn't work that way. Like, there is not always extra credit, quote unquote, or degrees to which it can be advanced. The fact that you do resistance training all of a sudden just goes and makes this huge circle of what could be in the realm of optimal. And ironically, while bodybuilders are trying to figure out the exact protein, carbohydrate, and fat number of grams they should eat, a lot of times if they just did protein and calories, they'd be fine for I'd say 80% of their diet, until they get to that point where they're truly scraping the bottom of the barrel, where having one macronutrient too low could be a substrate limiter, right? So for the most part, I am not worried about insulin sensitivity because they're always at least moderately insulin sensitive. And I think that kind of highlights the difference. Like Cliff was saying, like, I primarily work with strength athletes and bodybuilders. He has a whole lot of clinical experience, and I'm sure we would have different status quo approaches to nutrition. If we had reversed our roles, we might be in different, arguing the quote unquote opposite positions, even though we're quite moderate in both our cases. So insulin sensitivity is kind of like sure, it's important, but almost everyone is quite insulin sensitive in the bodybuilding community.
I want to see a comic book where Eric, like, it's one of those, otherworld comic books where Eric is a ketogenic researcher. That would be awesome. Eric Helms, Keto Man. No longer Captain America, now Keto Man.
Keto Man, I love it. And
he wouldn't have any muscle though.
Yeah,
like that.
There, you did it for me.
Eric, as part of what you're saying, so like insulin sensitivity isn't really something that bodybuilders should worry about, but elaborating a little further, but is there an advantage to maximizing that carbohydrate intake because they are insulin sensitive?
Potentially. So here's where some of the observational research gets interesting. So there was an observational study by Maystew and colleagues in 2010. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. I think it's a Scandinavian last name. And one of the observational correlates they found with who retained more muscle mass was who retained higher levels of insulin. So insulin levels, we love to kind of pigeonhole insulin, especially if you look at some of the different voices and different periods. If you go to the bodybuilding community, it's like the thing you got to make super high post-workout to make you jacked. If you go to the low-carb community, it's the devil and the cause of all fat gain. And it is a much more complicated hormone than that. It has influence on satiety. So I was talking earlier about, being on a low-fat diet could actually make you hungrier. It's like, well, maybe your insulin levels will probably be higher. And in someone who is metabolically functional and flexible, insulin does act as a satiety hormone. But then cholecystokinin will be lower because you're on a low-fat diet. So I don't know what's better, but I know the applied outcomes are that a higher fat diet, lower carb diet sometimes results in a greater level of satiety. And, that actually probably has more to do with the low carb component, maybe. But anyway, so not sure on the outcome there, but interesting observational outcome. Higher levels of insulin was correlated to greater retention of muscle mass. And then what Cliff was talking about regional differences, I don't know data on New Zealand or Australian bodybuilders, but if you look at South American bodybuilders, North American bodybuilders, and you compare them to the UK is dominated in the natural bodybuilding scene by very high carb diets. And I'm not saying this is causation, but in the natural bodybuilding world, they are also known to be some of the people who bring the most impressive conditioning in terms of actual leanness on stage. And well peaked, and just kind of like, oh damn, the guys from across the pond. This is the kind of an American speaking. They're going to bring serrated glutes. I've had clients who are peeled to the bone, and everyone in the top 5 at their nationals are as well. And if you look at the research, some of the recent work done by Andrew Chappell, who is also a competitive natural bodybuilder that I've had the opportunity of meeting and collaborating with, they have done a lot of observational research of some of the elite level amateurs and pro natural bodybuilders in the UK. And in general, higher placing amateurs and pros relative to amateurs have higher carbohydrate intakes. Now, we don't know that could be just purely a spurious correlation, or that could be a true relationship there, that the correlation is correlated. But we don't know which direction that, if there is causality, which way it goes. Is it that the people who are really good at bodybuilding are more carbohydrate sensitive, so therefore they find and they do better with higher carbohydrate diets and that benefits them? Or is it that people are going, hey, I'm going to go to a higher carbohydrate diet and I place better? I would suspect it's probably more the former, if I'm honest. But I think it is at least interesting that extremely high carbohydrate diets seem to be associated with better performance, at least in the UK, and it's actually stratified. And then when you look at, but then when you look at American bodybuilders and when you look at South American bodybuilders, you typically see lower carbohydrate intakes relative to that. And that is one of the first macronutrients to get picked on, I would say. In my coaching experience, I've seen the full breadth of things. Most people tend to do better on moderate to high relative to other macronutrients. I think the thing is when I say high carbohydrate, I think of it in the context of bodybuilders. If you say high carbohydrate to a sports performance researcher, they're thinking more than 60% of carbs in your diet. And when they would look at the absolute amounts that I'm talking about in a contest prep bodybuilder, they would think it was low carb. So it's almost like Cliff and I, in most cases, are talking about low carbohydrate diets and just across the spectrum of them because there's a deficit and because it's not an endurance athlete. So it is, I think it's all relative for one. Another thing, do you mind if I address and this could end up being a huge tangent, the hormonal effects of being on a low fat or high fat diet?
Go for it.
I think, go for it.
Okay. So I have trouble agreeing with any strength of conviction that the dietary fat component has a large impact or is a primary factor in what's going to dictate LH pulsatility, eventual amenorrhea, or other, a drop of testosterone in males, because by far and away the strongest and most robust line of research we have is that it's low energy availability.
Somewhat 100%.
Cool.
Yep.
So somewhat independent of macronutrient intake. And I think we've got a couple of studies done in the late 80s where they did show that dropping from like 30% of calories from fat to like 20%, there was a statistically significant drop in total testosterone. I don't know if this is in free, but in the context of someone who is dieting, far and away, it is total energy availability. And if you were to keep someone on a high fat diet, but drop their calories low, I would be very confident they would see all the symptoms of relative energy deficiency syndrome, low energy availability.
I agree with you. And that's an interesting one because quite often what we see popping up now in the fitness arena is that, it's almost like the converse of that a low carb diet or a keto diet will cause anovulation, distortions in luteinizing hormone pulsatility. And they often reference a study there's only really one. Lux and Thurma did a study a few years back looking at this. And because the absolute amount of carbohydrate was relatively low, and the paper was written in quite a convoluted way, so it was actually quite difficult to understand, but people assume that it was a low carbohydrate diet. One of the reasons for that is the authors wrote about it in terms of carbohydrate availability, but that was carbohydrate intake minus what they were conceivably using during their exercise activity, which was, a lot of exercise, and what was basically left, right? So it wasn't their carb intake, it was what was available after exercise. Anyway, when you actually look at what the diets were, it wasn't comparing low carb to anything else. It was comparing different amounts of energy restriction. And we basically saw a more or less linear association between the magnitude of energy restriction and how much female hormone balance across all those metrics was affected. The diets themselves were actually relatively high in carbohydrate as a proportion of the diet, but they were so calorie restricted that, of course, they ended up being relatively low, although not what we'd consider low in an absolute sense. And so I think there's a lot of misinterpretation there, and I agree 100%. I've talked about this with Eric before. I've talked about it with Dr. Dan Plews. I think everyone's pretty much on the same page that the biggest thing for that, and for a lot of other factors like overtraining, the effects of supposedly macronutrients on the cortisol to testosterone ratio, all that kind of stuff, they pale in comparison to just total energy availability.
Yeah. So I think we're on the same page there. And I haven't seen any like proper multivariate analyses, because these are most of the time they are changes, but they're looking at, or I'd say a trial where they're looking at changes in a group that has modified their macronutrient intake. And then looking at outcomes and associations, but they haven't really properly delved into what those associations are related to, like what he alluded to, testosterone cortisol ratio. There's a study on hockey players where the higher carb, lower fat group had a better testosterone to cortisol ratio. And then there's a study by Himalayan, that's another one of those Scandinavian names I guarantee I'm pronouncing wrong and pissing off most of Northern Europe. They've shown a couple times that dropping from 30% to 20% or high 20s to low 20s or high teens was associated with a lower total testosterone. But again, these are associations that I don't know how well the calorie consumption was controlled in these. A lot of the times when you make an acute change that's substantial to someone's macronutrient distributions, you get an alteration in appetite and satiety signaling. And that can go both ways, because if you give someone a whole bunch of carbohydrates sometimes and they're not used to it, depending on the carbohydrate source, you can see a reduction in, an increase in satiety due to, say, the overall energy density of the diet getting lower, but that may not last. So it's really difficult these aren't metabolic ward studies. We don't know really what happened to total energy intake. So just to put that out there.
Absolutely. There was I can't remember who the author was now. I'll have to look it up. I can send it through to you guys after the cast. But a 2016 study looked at, it was just an observational study, right? So they were basically looking at food frequency questionnaires, what was consumed and how that was associated with these various markers, particularly testosterone, but also anovulation and things like that. Now, they found that there was an association, a statistically significant association between the lipid intake and testosterone and other things like anovulation. However, was it meaningful? Probably not, because everyone was relatively calorie sufficient. They were eating ad libitum. It wasn't real, there was no calorie restriction. It was just an observational study. So on the strength of that, I think on the strength of that and most other research, we would say, yes, a higher fat intake results in a higher testosterone level in general. But is it meaningful? Probably not. I mean, you might be looking at something that is just a 0.01% increase across 1 million people is going to be highly statistically significant. Whether it's clinically meaningful or not is a whole different question.
And also, let's say it is clinically meaningful. Let's say a higher fat intake while dieting preserves your testosterone levels to some clinically meaningful degree. But I think many bodybuilders would make the assumption, okay, that's what I want. And that's because bodybuilders are obsessed with testosterone. And in fact, most males over the age of 25 are too. So anytime I got bad sleep, I wonder if my test is low, like I'm going to go get checked out, Yeah. But I think what a bodybuilder really cares about, if we could show it, would be what helps you preserve the most muscle mass.
Yeah.
And preserving a higher testosterone level at the theoretical cost of being able to perform well, or potentially insulin levels being low, we don't necessarily know which is going to be best for preserving muscle mass, which is what actually matters. An interesting thing, for example, is that if you look at all the case studies of bodybuilders, women across the board are way better at maintaining muscle mass, but men typically lose it. So you could make the argument that, testosterone isn't important because women are maintaining muscle mass without it. Or you could say, no, testosterone is important because the men see a drop and they see a drop in testosterone. There's a lot of ways that I could make these rational kind of inversions and create a scenario where it either is or isn't the most important thing in the world. And I think you see that a lot of times based on the bias someone brings. But until we truly have some good analyses in dieting individuals where they look at the relationships in a statistically appropriate way on either a low or a high fat and concomitantly low or high carbohydrate diet, or are we going to have true confidence there?
Yeah.
The saying, success leaves clues, though. I think what we can at least say when looking at natural bodybuilders who we know they're going to see this drop in testosterone because they're not supplementing with testosterone, who are on high carb, low fat diets, is that at the very least, it is not impairing their ability to perform at a very high level against other competitors who are on opposing types of diets when they go to Worlds and perform pretty well. So take that for what it is. I at the very least, I think the observational data can tell us that having a diet when you're in stage condition at 30 versus say 15% of your calories from fat is not going to be a game changer.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point, because I think something that Eric's alluding to there is it's really important for people to be aware of the research continuum. We'll start by looking at something in a petri dish, and we'll get some ideas there about how that might relate to an in vivo experience. So we study it in animals. We see, proxy markers being indicated by that. We might then study that in humans. But for any particular outcome, we need to be looking at the functional outcome, because, the research process, if we're looking at, okay, well, this type of diet will increase testosterone or will preserve testosterone, let's say, and our outcome is actually to retain as much muscle as possible and lose as much fat as possible, we can't just leave it at the testosterone level. We then need to look at whether that plays out in terms of this diet. So we're basically going from diet A to outcome C, rather than saying diet A equals outcome B, which inevitably results in outcome C, which plays into a lot of our area of research in terms of, metabolic adaptations to diet. I'm not talking about calories here. I'm talking about how the body adjusts to different macronutrients, because we'll so often see the debate left at the proxy measure. This diet increases LDL cholesterol, therefore it's going to give you heart disease. Well, we need to take the next step and actually look at people following diets and whether they emerge with heart disease or heart disease mortality later on in life, because if not, it shows that the proxy doesn't necessarily equal the outcome.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I would say the low carbohydrate versus high carbohydrate space is rife with this error, where people will look at a pathway or a specific hormone in absence of a randomized controlled trial and make an assumption and build an entire, sometimes empire, based on that, whether it's insulin or whether it's a paradigm of training or eating based on an assumption. I think it's just really important. That's why I read the stuff on mechanisms and understand it to the best of my little sports science brain can. But when it comes to what I truly base my practice on, it's going to be the applied studies. It's like another example is the fat adaptation literature. The whole, like, if you're a fat adapted athlete, which is largely endurance athletes, like we said, it looks like you're not actually depleting glycogen as much as you think you are. So it's totally fine. And one of the assumptions based on that was, all right, well, then if we switch to carbohydrates at the end and then compete, it should provide a better outcome, because now you're using a higher percentage of fat for fuel and you've spared carbohydrates. So you're going to have all the fuel availability in the world. And only recently have we found that doesn't actually work that way. You can't really have your cake and eat it too, or your low fat cake and then your high fat icing and eat it at the same time and get all the benefits, because you actually are suppressing some of the pathways of actually accessing that glycogen. So for example, when you follow a low carbohydrate diet for a while, yes, you preserve glycogen, but you also suppress some of the enzymes related to carbohydrate oxidation, like pyruvate dehydrogenase. So yeah, you've got this glycogen, but you can't tap into it because you're quote unquote fat adapted. So our body can adapt in many ways, but some things are a bit that you can't always have it both ways, I guess is what I'm saying. And that's one of those things we didn't even realize until, say, like 2016 with some of the research that came out there. So, and
that's constantly being reevaluated now as well. I think that some of the purported inability to use carbohydrate based on these enzymatic downgrades is now being cast into some
doubt.
I mean, it's certainly being discussed. There was a very interesting paper came out just about a month ago, which I'll have to send through to you, Eric, and that was one of the discussion points. Now, there's obviously nothing definitive here, because there are so many complex relationships on a cellular level in terms of fuel availability and how that fuel is utilized. as soon as we start to go down the rabbit hole of one particular enzymatic pathway or the effects of, a hormone on one particular function, we're always going to be doing ourselves a disservice. And that's why
Yes.
I think we need to, kind of like Eric said, we need to go down the mechanistic rabbit hole and try and understand that and how it might apply. But then we need to take a big step back and say, well, how does that actually apply to athletes that we work with? What does the research say about extant athletes that have been looked at? Does it make sense? I mean, is it plausible that this would happen when we see these particular outcomes? If I believed a lot of the insulin hypothesis stuff, it would simply be impossible that there are so many high-performing bodybuilders in the UK who have got striated glutes because, hey, you can't do that if you've got that much insulin in your body. It's impossible. So obviously it's a conspiracy where Donald Trump and, Boris in the UK have got together and they're promoting this conspiracy that you can actually get lean with high levels of insulin. I mean, I don't buy it because, the earth is flat and all that kind of stuff.
I can't argue with that.
So I quickly want to circle.
Trump's fault. But go ahead.
I quickly want to circle back to carbohydrate intake in the context of a bodybuilder's training program. So I'll start out to Eric. Does the amount of carbohydrate in the athlete's diet affect how you would recommend structuring their training program? So, for example, I know that you've done full body training recently at a high frequency. So if you took a bodybuilder running that same full body high frequency split, would you be perhaps more keen to minimizing their fat intake and then trying to maximize their carbohydrate intake for just kind of that overall gross amount of work they need to do per session?
I think it would sound like I would say yes, but I think the assumption when you hear full body is that it therefore must be higher volume. But in actuality, when I do full body, the volume per muscle group is lower per session. The total work per week is probably the same or maybe higher if I have found that I recover better doing a full body distribution. But the potential benefit of higher frequency approaches primarily, although you could argue there's some small benefits just of the frequency in and of itself. But primarily, when you look at the aggregate data, higher frequencies allow for better recovery when training muscle groups multiple times. So if you were trying to access higher volumes, a higher frequency approach is helpful because it keeps the per session per muscle group volume lower or per session per movement pattern volume lower. But since we're talking about bodybuilders, we'll talk about the per session per body part. So the actual total volume of someone doing a body part split, like let's say if they have an arm day, they might be getting all 10 of their direct arm work sets in that same day. So they might be doing, 3 sets of 3 to 4 on biceps, 3 sets of 3 to 4 on triceps. For one, sounds like a great day to me. But for two, that means that session is actually going to deplete their biceps and triceps glycogen a lot more than if you had a full body approach where you just did 3 sets of biceps and 3 sets of triceps across 4 different workouts. So I actually don't think that the frequency in and of itself would modify that. To broadly answer the question of how does bodybuilding training modify your carbohydrate needs, this is also a kind of a gappy area. We've got a fair amount of research, some of which I've been fortunate to be a part of, looking at strength athletes, so power lifters and Olympic lifters who have gone through case series and actual studies of ketogenic diets. And they largely seem to be able to preserve short-term performance in what I would describe as following low-ish volume approaches. And that's kind of cool, I do think there are probably phases of training where the total glycogen depletion might be higher for certain muscle groups, and that may not be appropriate. But I don't actually have the data to support that. I think across the continuum of substrate utilization and total energy expenditure, the people who are probably most robust to following a low carbohydrate diet are actually strength athletes. And that's just because the total amount of energy expenditure is quite low. And the dominant energy system is actually ATP-CP. But that's not to say that when you go through a volume phase, if you're doing a lot of accessory work, or certain classes of strength athletes like strongmen or strong women who sometimes have 60-second bouts of maximal effort, and then have timed events that are in a medley format. And we we tend to think of our energy systems as separate, but in reality, a lot of them are fueling each other. And it's kind of like a bunch of people all pushing a car, and then one person takes a break, and while one of the people gets that person water so they can get back into it. It's all this kind of cyclical thing. So, you know, I would say for a CrossFit athlete or a strongman or strong woman, I would probably be, and a bodybuilder as well, I would probably try to maintain a slightly higher carbohydrate intake than, say, for an Olympic lifter or a power lifter in certain phases of training. Could probably get away with it. So in the context of bodybuilders, overall, I do think a very low carb approach doesn't match their training demands in general, just because they have kind of a necessarily higher volume than strength athletes typically. But I think that's somewhat independent of frequency.
I think that I agree. You know, in general, I agree with Eric, as on most things. I think what we can see both from the research and from, you know, experience, clinical application, is that it very much is volume dependent. And so I agree that, you know, just doing by nature a full body workout isn't necessarily going to be high volume. There's obviously that research that Eric's been involved in. There's other studies as well showing there's not necessarily a decrement to performance from being on, say, a keto diet if you're a strength athlete or a power lifter. Or actually most other athletes in explosive sports who are doing relatively low volumes. We've seen the same. I think Rachel Gregory did a study on CrossFit athletes a few years back, training 3 times a week and no decrement to performance from a ketogenic diet. Really,
would you call it a CrossFit athlete if they're only training 3 times a week, or would you call that someone who goes to a CrossFit gym now?
Well, no, good point. And that's exactly what I was going to say, was that, you know, because I've worked a lot with CrossFit athletes, and I've worked a lot with, you know, recreational CrossFit athletes. They compete, but they're competing at a lower level. They're maybe training 3 or 4 times a week. And some of them thrive on a ketogenic diet. Some of them thrive on a low carb diet. And that's often as well because they're not at that level where they've trained consistently for many years. They're maybe not, you know, it's not the survivorship bias where they're built for CrossFit or those types of things. So perhaps they're more metabolically dysregulated. They've got insulin resistance. They're best off on a low carb diet anyway. And so that's also conducive to their sport. Whereas the top level athletes that I've worked with in CrossFit who are training, you know, 2 or 3 times a day and often for relatively long sessions, and it's all that multimodal work, in almost all cases, they do not do well on a low carb diet. They simply need that carbohydrate to fuel glycogen for those higher energy pathways. One thing I'll throw in there, though, which I think is critically important, and I know we've probably alluded to this before, is I think we suffer from a little bit of perception bias when we're talking about low carb. Because when people talk about low carb, they're immediately thinking, well, low carb's under, let's say, 50 grams of carbs, and keto's under 20 grams of carbs. And I don't think that's appropriate to our modern understanding of carbohydrate intake. I say that because let's say at baseline, you do really well on a low carb diet for whatever reason. Ethnogenetically, you might have a tendency towards insulin resistance, whatever. Now that might change over time and you might do better on higher carbs later on. That's fine. But at this point, let's say you just do best on a low carb diet and you start increasing your training volume massively, you're going to increase your carbs anyway. Now, it doesn't mean that that still is not a low carb or ketogenic diet. And I think I mentioned to you guys the little N of 1 I did myself, where I think I got up to around 200, 240 grams of carbs a day, and I was still getting into ketosis every following day. That's because at the time I was training like a maniac. I had a relatively long fasting window. You know, I was basically, and I'm insulin, you know, counter to perception, I'm very insulin sensitive, and I actually deal with carbs very effectively. And so therefore I'm able to basically bounce in and out. And we see that quite commonly now. So I think the important thing from my point of view for people to remember is that in a general sense, as volume increases, it's highly likely that your carb intake needs to increase irrespective of whether you're following a low carb, moderate or high carb paradigm. You know, testament to that is the idea that glycogen levels can be the same between a low carb and high carb athlete, and glycogen repletion rates can be the same. But if those athletes train using relatively high intensity modalities for greater than 90 minutes, they're both going to need carb supplementation to preserve performance. Doesn't matter whether you're low or high carb.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
I'm from New Zealand as well, by the way, not Boston. I started sounding like Mark Wahlberg when I was saying carb.
Cabs.
Yeah, cabs.
Cabs, go get some cabs. Yeah.
All right. So circling back to kind of this insulin sensitivity talk we're having here. I think we kind of touched on some of this already, but just to hit home on it. So Cliff mentioned that for some athletes who are less insulin sensitive, he might set fat at a 60 to 80% of their calories to really push their fat loss. And he kind of postulated that due to this constrained energy intake, there may not be enough carbohydrate available to optimize how the athlete's feeling, and that greater BHB concentrations could ameliorate this. So, Eric, have you ever experimented with transitioning an athlete to a modified kind of ketogenic approach during contest? And have you noticed any unique benefits for them?
Man, it's so rare that I hesitate to leverage those anecdotes because, I mean, we're talking about, I think I calculated one time I've helped about 300 people to stage. And that hasn't changed a lot since I figured that out in 2014 or 15 because I've greatly reduced the number of athletes I work with. And a lot of them are the same athletes now coming back who I've worked with for years. But I think at that point, when I calculated that, I could specifically recall 3 people who used a ketogenic approach. I've definitely had people who have used a higher fat rather than lower fat approach, but we're talking the difference between 20% of calories versus 40%, you know, because in the end, almost everyone's on a low fat and low carb diet, you know, so it just kind of sucks. So the anecdotally in those time periods, what I have seen is that those individuals felt more consistent energy instead of kind of peaks and valleys. And that the adherence to the diet was better, which is probably directly related to having consistent energy. You know, the things that break a bodybuilder are not always just I'm starving and I'm really, really hungry. That's definitely there. But just that creeping lethargy and your legs feeling like they're made out of bricks is something that kind of gets to everybody, even when they have, you know, high macros and just a total high energy intake because they're, you know, just the lucky few of us who get to eat a lot during prep, but it still feels terrible. So I have seen that. And then more often what I have seen is that people in the off season, which is, in my opinion, a better time to experiment, because if someone talking about insulin sensitive, insulin resistant, if there is going to be a time point where you do experience some, say, genetic bias towards insulin resistance, it would probably be in a point when you're in a surplus, higher in body fat, not doing cardio, and kind of just living that good off-season life, right? And I have definitely had individuals who, now here's an interesting thing. I've had individuals who, to some degree independent of their total calorie intake, will have leaner off seasons if they have a cap on their absolute fat intake level. Like I've seen people who can eat a higher total calories by 10, 20%, just keeping fat low and driving carbs up, which is interesting. And I've had people who experience almost the exact opposite. But it's rare in the bodybuilding population to where they can, and you'll see the same report from different communities. You'll see people who are talking about like, hey, so long as I keep my carbs low, I can keto bulk on almost endless calories and I won't, gain fat. And then I'll go hang out with a bunch of natural bodybuilders and they're like, so long as I keep my fat under 50 grams, I can jack my calories up into 200, 300 and just eat a bunch of carbs, you know? And it's literally the opposite anecdote. So which is interesting. So I would suspect, I don't know if it's just insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance. There seems to be mixed data indicating that's probably part of the physiological milieu that did I pronounce that right? That results in what you do better in terms of like leanness at a steady state intake, high or low carb. But yeah, I don't think we know what the full picture is of what's likely to cause that, but I've definitely seen anecdotes going both ways.
I would suspect to some degree a lot of that comes down, from my perspective at least, a lot of it comes down to the psychosocial environment of the person, their behavioral tendencies, their personality type. And those are very unquantifiable things in a lot of cases. You know, we alluded to it in a paper that we did on the sort of qualitative effects or qualitative outcomes from a ketogenic diet, in which we sort of saw, we thought we saw that there was a fairly defined split between people we class as moderators versus abstainers, and how that drove adherence for those people. You know, moderators, in other words, were more likely to have their heads around portion control and were more moderate in their carb intake and things like that, whereas the abstainers were ones who felt that carbs were going to drive them over the edge and were better off just eliminating them. But I think a lot of those things play into what people are able to do. And I'd suspect a lot of the reason why, someone doing really well in a low carb diet, for example, in the off season, is simply because they're not realizing they're doing it, but they're auto-regulating their energy intake into an appropriate level, even if that is slightly hypercaloric to gain muscle, whereas the low-fat person might be doing exactly the same thing through a different mechanism. And that's probably particularly true if those people at baseline are also eating a diet that's based on a compendium of more unrefined foods. Because if that's the case, in a bulking phase, I don't think it matters too much. Although I would probably tend to, with my athletes, if we are looking to put on muscle, I would tend to be increasing the carbs because, it may be just a bias of mine, but I think that from experience, carbs are just anabolic. It's easier to, and that also could be to do with just eating more. It's easier to eat more when you have a mixed diet that includes carbohydrate than if you're, say, low carb.
Yeah. And I think that has there's so many mechanisms we could look at there. Like I would say the limited data all point in the same direction, that it's quite difficult to put on muscle mass on a very low carb diet. That could be simply related to, flavor fatigue and satiety and just not getting enough calories. Or there are some mechanistic reasons as to, like, Cliff said, carbs are anabolic. You could make the argument that that not having enough carbohydrates could downregulate some of the pathways towards increasing muscle protein synthesis and et cetera. That's not strong data by any means, but that's another one of the kind of the general reasons I'm not super comfortable with very low carb diets for bodybuilders in general. Dieting or in a surplus, and this might be a point where Cliff and I disagree, is because of that data showing it's difficult to put on muscle mass on a low carb diet. The mechanisms for maintaining muscle and growing muscle are basically the same. It's not like when you start a diet, everything changes, and now like you switched your human mode from surplus to deficit, and now all of a sudden the metabolic machinery has changed. It's not really the case. We still grow from the synthesis of, or I'd say total muscle protein balance. MPS minus MPB equals your change in muscle mass, and that's still true in a deficit. It's just that synthesis now, when you're in a deficit, doesn't go as high. And once you get lean, MPB also goes up. So you're still trying to do what you can to get this signal as high as you can. And for those just listening, that's MPS. And if ketogenic diets for some reason impede that, I'm hesitant to apply that in the context of someone who wants to do everything they can to maintain muscle mass or grow it.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic, actually, because number one, I think we can often become too polarized into thinking that, well, I'm anabolic versus catabolic. Because let's face it, if you were solely anabolic, you would be gaining weight overall at an incredibly rapid rate, and you'd die very quickly. Because all of the catabolic processes that are necessary would not be occurring. There'd be no autophagy. You'd basically probably get cancer and die within a couple of months, if not sooner because of other things.
Huge, bro.
Exactly. But it's an interesting context because I broadly agree, and Eric and I have discussed this in workshops before. I think that we would broadly agree that the environment you set up that is conducive to gaining muscle is pretty similar. In many cases, it's identical to the one you would have to offset muscle loss. The big shift there is, while you're trying to limit fat gain in a gaining phase, you're trying to maximize fat gain in the loss phase. And I guess it's just the balance between those two outcomes that possibly can be manipulated and makes it a little bit different, although not entirely distinct from gaining. Where I'm really going with that is, I think there are subtle factors at play that need further research. I was called out a while back on Twitter for a post I wrote years and years ago where I said that, a perpetual increase in insulin is likely to inhibit fat loss. And everyone sort of jumped on it and said, no, that's all bullshit because the insulin hypothesis sucks, basically. And I had to kind of agree and walk it back a little bit, but I just don't think we have the research at this stage to definitively say that some perpetual increase in insulin, as a lot of people experience through the day, through snacking behaviors and things like that, I wouldn't say it drives a lot of fat gain. But what I have a strong suspicion towards, and I'd like to do further research in this, is that smaller amounts of insulin are potentially playing a bigger role in causing people to be resistant to fat loss. Now, I actually think it's a fairly minor topic when we look at everything else in terms of protein intake and total energy availability and things like that. It's a very small piece, but I think it's an interesting one. Similarly, I think that we are often in the performance field very quick to ignore some of the mechanistic and functional evidence that's coming through on things like fasting. I'm really interested in fasting. I think it's a very it's of interest to me, obviously, for clinical outcomes. But one thing that's coming through there is that a lot of the potential benefits, albeit quite small, are probably from number one, regulation of total energy input. Number two, differentiating between carbohydrate, protein, and lipid effects on the body, particularly in terms of catabolic processes, whereby carbs probably have a bigger effect on inhibiting certain catabolic processes. Now, that could be looked at in different ways, right? If we begin to look at that in a broader sense of the total anabolic versus catabolic environment in the body, we might say, well, that's a good thing for retaining muscle, but maybe it's not quite so good in terms of the signaling, and especially on an epigenomic level, of potentially freeing up fat to use as fuel in a situation of environmental stress, right? In other words, we're in a starvation state. So perhaps we're going to tap into those fat stores a little bit more. Then we need to look at that in the context of, well, does that happen for a lot of people? And we simply don't know whether our metabolic status at baseline is going to play a big role in shifting that as well. In other words, we basically circle back to what we were originally talking about. If you're more insulin sensitive and better metabolic condition, it's probably not going to matter much at all. But if underlying you are a little bit more insulin resistant or have a metabolic distortion of some sort, perhaps that plays into it. All of which probably becomes somewhat meaningless when we're talking about high-level bodybuilders, because again, they're going to be insulin-sensitive people who also are the beneficiaries of survivorship bias, where they've got through the attrition game of being a top bodybuilder, and so they're genetically built for that. Did that make any sense?
No, that absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd love to build on it if you guys don't mind this tangent rabbit hole getting a little deeper, actually.
Go for it.
Sure,
Dig deeper, Eric.
Okay, cool. So there's a really good quote by the statistician George Box. All models are wrong, but some models are useful. And I think while we have now had experimental evidence that falsifies the most simplistic version of the insulin hypothesis, I think that has resulted in some people then just fully jumping ship and saying, well, everything about it is totally wrong and makes no sense. But we can't refute the fact that insulin does inhibit lipolysis. Like that's still one of the functions of insulin. That doesn't change. So I honestly think, Cliff, you shouldn't have, in a very strict interpretation, shouldn't have had to walk back that tweet, right? Because the issue with the insulin hypothesis is saying carbs result in high insulin levels. High insulin levels inhibit lipolysis. Therefore, high carbohydrate diets can't result in fat loss. But the whole thing we're talking about here, the supposition of insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance, means that people have different insulin responses to the same foods, quantities, and proportions. So that means these bodybuilders on these super high carb diets, their insulin excursion, the heights it reaches, and the tissues that insulin impacts, and how long it stays elevated are vastly different than a type 2 diabetic, despite even maybe following the same total carbohydrate intake. They're going to see, preferential shuttling in muscle, but not necessarily fat. They're going to see shorter excursions of insulin, and they're still going to be plenty of time in the day to be to have that deficit working towards fat loss. So it's not necessarily that insulin doesn't function the way we know it functions because Kevin Hall's study. What it means is that you can't simply look at just one factor and then make this broad sweeping conclusion. So we need a much more nuanced understanding of the role of insulin in suppressing fat loss in the context of people with different metabolic quote unquote flexibilities and different diets, and understanding that, okay, so to what degree and for how much, for how long does insulin suppress fat loss? And then at times when insulin is not present, is there an accelerated rate of fat loss and use of that as fuel because of what happened before? And in fact, there must be, or these guys wouldn't be getting striated glutes with high carb diets. So it's just simply understanding that we need more nuance, and that the insulin hypothesis in its most basic sense is as wrong as every other hypothetical model, because models are heuristics. They're simplifications so we can understand something. So we know it's wrong. And now we've just established, that really strict interpretation is not useful. So, we don't start like throwing out all our textbooks that talk about the actions of insulin now. The question is, all right, well, to what degree, when, and for whom, and what does that have to say about what type of diet people should follow? And there's a ton of questions remaining there.
Yeah. Well, I think as well, it also means that because we talk about things like, and I appreciate you saying that, Eric, because that sort of, I think, clarifies it much better than I did. But often when we talk about these mechanistic things, like, Eric's talking about the actions of insulin, and we're going down the rabbit hole a little bit with that, or I might talk about the effects of fasting on monocyte-driven inflammation, blah, blah, blah. We're going down the rabbit hole on these things. But when we return to a pragmatic position of saying, let's take fasting, for example, well, all these things occur and that's really cool. We've got the evidence for it. But you know what the biggest impact of fasting for almost all people, almost all of the time, is? It helps them auto-regulate their energy intake. They have a shorter feeding window, and the evidence tells us that within that shorter feeding window, they tend to not overeat as much as if they were eating through the entire day. It's pretty simple.
Shocker, but when I put all shockers, not eating helps fat loss. Yeah.
And we're not shocked by that. But if I put out a post, as I often do, saying that, I will get messages from fasting advocates saying, basically, hey, bro, don't you know about autophagy, mitophagy, all these various things, because that's why fasting works. Not really. That's the sexy stuff that might also occur, and we need to look into it more, and there might be some potential extra benefits, whatever, particularly for clinical sub-pops, but let's walk this back and be pragmatic. The biggest thing, and the reason why most diets work, is because of energy manipulation. How you achieve that energy manipulation is basically down to your particular circumstance and what's going to work best for you, and how you can adhere to that over the long term. Notwithstanding that, as Eric and I have discussed previously, your ideal diet, number one, might not be ideal if you can't stick to it. Number two, the ideal diet will change depending on what your outcome is at any given time and how you've changed. That's an interesting point, because let's say you do really well on a low-carb diet. 3 years down the track, through adhering to that low-carb diet and getting in all your training and going for a walk and meditating, get enough sleep, all that kind of stuff, hey, you might be better off on a moderate carb diet or even a high-carb diet because you've improved your baseline metabolic resilience to such a high degree.
So the context of this discussion has been completely revolved around contest preparation and dieting, but I kind of
plus or minus 5 rabbit holes. Yes.
Plus or minus 5 rabbit holes. With that being said, we are already in the rabbit hole insulin sensitivity, and this thought came to my mind. So let's continue down here. Let's try to find that rabbit since we're here. I want you guys to speculate on this. In the off season, this is about the only period of time where a bodybuilder might become more prone to insulin resistance, perhaps genetically, or they're really in that extended off season where they're pushing their body fat pretty high. In this scenario, do you think there's potential application for carbohydrate cycling, or specifically having low carbohydrate days in order to keep the individual a little more insulin sensitive, allow them to carry out that off season a little longer at a higher body fat and still respond favorably well? Is there any application there? Eric, start us off.
I think something will have to be phasic, because if you're going to be in a surplus to push muscle mass, you're going to gain a certain amount of body fat. And if you're a competitive bodybuilder, you don't want to start a diet really high in body fat, because then either you need a higher deficit or be in a deficit for longer. So it's kind of this catch-22, where whether you do cyclical mini cuts or whether you do high and low days, or more on off days, or less on off days, more on days, or you manipulate your macronutrients, in the end, you are doing something phasic over time during your off season to make sure you don't start prep in a point that's not ideal, which is either with no muscle mass added because you tried to stay too lean or manipulated shit too much and your off season was just hitting pause before you dieted down again, or having more muscle mass but so much fat that you're going to lose that muscle mass in the process of getting dieted. And there are many strategies you can approach. You might be okay with being in that position, but then you're going to try to get ready early and eat up. You might have a cyclical approach to dieting, where you try to regain lost tissue and then diet back down. Or, like you said, you might have these days of being in a deficit and interspersed with more days in a surplus. So you have a day-to-day regulation of energy intake to mitigate fat gain, or you might have week-to-week, or you could take the approach I like, because I think it's more suitable to some of the behaviors I want to preserve in a bodybuilder so they don't lose their mind and quit the sport and not have a career at all, which is, let's take a longer off season, and I want you to be basically eating at a auto-regulated surplus for months and months and months, and then we go through a concentrated diet phase. Because if you're always in this place of regulating your macronutrients, regulating your energy intake, going in and out of pretty frequent diets, you're pretty much always exerting some level of dietary restraint, which, depending on how it's done, is going to have some degree of negative impact on your interoceptive awareness. That's your ability to gauge your own body signals. So satiety, hunger, and this is measured in like studies on intuitive eating of how well you can count your own heartbeats. And if you look at people who rely primarily on external cues, like tracking macros, weighing themselves, and everything that dictates what they do as an athlete is some external data, and they're using very little biofeedback, you get worse and worse and worse at recognizing biofeedback. And then you become limited to how good of an athlete you can be, especially at an advanced level, that's dictated by how individualized your approach can be based on external metrics. So how well can you guesstimate your energy expenditure on a day-to-day basis, or make assumptions about your insulin resistance or sensitivity, and then manipulate your macros, which is, in my opinion, folly, because we don't have some implanted AI in our body that constantly measures like glucose and insulin levels and all that. The best tools we have to auto-regulate and individualize your approach is you have the keys to, you as the athlete. If you can get a good sense of what your actual satiety and hunger are, what your cravings are, how stressed you feel, how restrained you feel, and if you want to actually have a career in bodybuilding for as long as you want, rather than being a victim of the sport, someone who can't keep competing long term, the eventual thing you need to focus on is finding a way to integrate bodybuilding with your life, rather than being subject to meal plans or macros or any other external way of regulating your food intake. So I think theoretically the answer is yes to your question. Practically the answer is it should come from something that is integrated and auto-regulated through your own body awareness.
Cliff, do you think there's any potential in utilizing low carbohydrate days in the off season for insulin sensitivity and maximizing the anabolic response to training?
I think there can be, but it's not that low carb's a magic bullet. I think it speaks more to what Eric was saying about we don't want to let that off season get to the point where we're just obese, right? Or with obesity, as we say nowadays. Because I don't think that's going to be conducive to further muscle growth anyway. Plus, it's going to put us at risk of, these negative health ramifications. And that's when potentially insulin resistance is going to be more of a factor. But it's because we've let it get to that point. So number one, I certainly don't think low carb is a magic bullet for that. I don't think it's also a magic bullet for sort of improving insulin sensitivity, if we want to talk about it that way, in the off season, because a higher carb athlete is not going to be insulin resistant, as a matter of course. In fact, they're likely to not be, because they are so active, and particularly a bodybuilder doing that resistance training, they're going to be more likely to be insulin sensitive. Just as likely also to be fat adapted, because it's a misnomer that we think that, well, fat adaptation means you're a low carb athlete. Well, no, people should do a low carb approach if it's appropriate for them in order to improve their fat adaptation. But, we can measure someone who's on an 80% calories from carb diet and their RER is perfect, it looks like they're burning fuel appropriately. They're fat adapted, right? So I think that the better approach really is to work exactly on what Eric was saying. We want to have an auto-regulated surplus in which people can hold enough body fat to not be restricted, but not so much as to put their health at risk. If that's the case, then they're basically in the perfect state to both gain and remain healthy so that they can keep training. And also remembering that in having that caloric surplus, we should be able to do a truckload of training. Training volumes are going to be higher to elicit hypertrophy, but also because we've got more fuel. And that's not just allowing us to train more on a physiological level. It's also giving us that psycho-neurophysiological impulse to train because we're calorie sufficient. Because of that increase in training, we're more likely to preserve insulin status as well. So I would always be resistant to sort of almost over dieting or over attending to diet through an off season, because that might be counterproductive in terms of not allowing that increase in volume as well. It's almost like that G-flux idea, right? I train more, so I eat more, so that I train more, so that I eat more. And that's that sort of cycle. Now, that can't be perpetual either, but in a phasic situation that a bodybuilder is going to be in, it's not going to be perpetual anyway. I really think that overall the key is to take care of those basics, have auto-regulation of energy, and also for people in bodybuilding to be a little bit more aware, I think, of getting some of the foundational aspects of nutrition right, like eating enough vegetables, right? Which is often neglected during dieting because you're just you don't want to almost waste space, or you're not really worried about it because you're so focused on the macros. And gaining, obviously, you don't want to waste space either, and you want to basically just be getting in your macros without worrying about the fundamental things that help to preserve health, which is obviously going to be important for being able to gain muscle.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, I just because Cliff was talking about training volume and training and the impacts on how you're actually quite insulin sensitive in most cases anyway in the off season. I think we just forget how powerful activity and resistance training are for modifying insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity, and that practical issues with the demands of being a bodybuilder, like I was talking about, just starting too high in body fat for a prep to get lean without losing muscle mass, are going to become an issue far before you actually have metabolic issues because your body fat's so high. Kind of case in point. Actually, I'll bandy out a couple of lines of research. There was a study that came out, I'm forgetting the main author, but they basically looked at someone at a class of men who were overweight, or with overweight, as Cliff alludes to, that's the proper terminology now, with obesity, or those who are normal, quote unquote, in terms of their BMI and body fat levels. And there was an anabolic resistance to protein and muscle in the people with obesity, but not in those who would be classified as overweight. So that's people not resistance training. So even not training, the body fat level you'd have to get to is a lot higher than even what the typical bodybuilder would consider high in the off season. And then when you start training, man, it gets driven up much higher. And the reason, and we have observational data to back that up. If you look at super heavyweight powerlifters and bodybuilders in like the IPF, for example, there was a case study done on Ray Williams, who has the highest raw squat and drug tested federations, incredibly high lean body mass despite having a pretty high body fat, which the case study I think does a very bad job of analyzing. They actually use an equation that's appropriate for Asian men. Ray Williams is not an Asian man, and so it measured him in the high 20s. Realistically, no offense to Ray Williams, amazing athlete, he's probably in the high 30s if I had to guess just looking at him, but still has a crap ton of lean muscle mass and the force production to go with it. So it shows that if there truly was some impact of having a high level of body fat on your quote-unquote anabolic resistance training in and of itself seems to really push that quite far away. Super heavies aren't having trouble getting stronger. Likewise, if you want to know which athletes carry the most fat-free mass on the planet, it's not bodybuilders in the off season, it's sumo wrestlers, and they're moving that weight around. Like wrestlers are always doing resistance training, and the resistance is the person they're going against. Sumo wrestlers are doing that while carrying a 200-pound weighted vest on at all times, basically all over their body. So I think it just goes to show, like, some of these concerns of bodybuilders about, oh crap, I'm over 15% body fat. It's like, well, you'd probably actually need to be over like 35% body fat for that to be an issue as a male, before that's a problem in most cases, so long as you're still training hard. So sure, there might be some small differences, but it doesn't even approach what we're seeing in people with like pre-diabetes or anything like that.
I think that's also a good point, because I don't know if it's still as apparent, but I know for a number of years, let's say from the late sort of, that 2000s decade into the early 2010s, it was almost as if people were looking down on exercise, disparaging exercise. It's not effective for body fat because we've got this one study showing women training 5 times a week lost, only a tiny bit more than those not training, and blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. What we're not looking at there is the long-term effects on substrate efficiency and utilization from the higher intensity activity, particularly resistance training, and particularly where people are doing a high volume of that. I think it's incredibly protective. And I think we can see that as well. We can see it in the long-term mortality and health data. But, in terms of the practical experience of working with athletes over, 2+ decades, some athletes I've worked with for that long, my entire time in clinical practice, you would have to say that the suspicion is very high that there's a massive protective effect, both against adiposity, but also in terms of their health status, which then plays into their ability to, say, gain muscle in the off season from having those high volumes of high intensity activity.
Mm-hmm.
I think you guys sufficiently drilled that point home. Fantastic. To transition into our final topic of this discussion, you can't talk about carbs and contest prep without discussing refeeds. So Eric, 3DMJ, just came out with a great episode on your podcast about refeeds, and I would say in general, refeeds were portrayed in a super beneficial light, as they should. But as you guys acknowledge, the research is scant, but when it comes to the anecdotes of bodybuilders, pretty much all around positives. I kind of wanted to touch on some potential drawbacks with refeeds, which I've seen with some of the people I coach and myself, and just kind of get your thoughts on them. So I think the major one is potential psychological issues in respects to certain people overly looking forward to these 1 or 2 days per week. And basically it actually almost makes their diet, it makes them suffer more, because now those other 5 days are even worse. On top of this, another point being is that it seems like people are utilizing refeeds all the time from the very start of prep, where calorie intake's in a good place. Energy availability really isn't a concern, and I think the most potential use for refeeds is when there is a state of low energy availability. And I think when that's not a concern and people are utilizing refeeds at a time where overall calories are adequate, I think they could be doing their overall training a disservice by having these radical differences in calorie intake between these days, when it's really not beneficial, right? So like if you say the average size bodybuilder, and he has an average daily intake of 2,800 potentially, but he would rather have these 2 giant refeed days at 35 to 4,000 so he can eat a box of cereal, and then on these other 5 days, he's down at 2,000. I think that could potentially have a negative impact on his training, more so than if he just kept calories consistent. So touch on that point for us, touch on the potential psychological impact, and if you're doing anything to assess the psychology of an athlete when you're determining the difference in intake between high and low days.
Yeah, I love the way you frame that, because a lot of the potential issues you highlighted were not in refeeds or not. They were in why someone is refeeding, what they're focused on when they're refeeding, the application of refeeds, and then how they are specifically recommended. So there is actually a study that is in review, and I'm pretty sure it's going to get published pretty soon. It's already been presented as an abstract, by Dr. Campbell out of his lab, where we actually have the first experimental comparison of refeeds compared to non-refeeds. So the applied outcome here is actually quite favorable, and they just simply looked at the same net weekly deficit, but applied equally over 7 days, or over 5 days with 2 days on the weekends at maintenance, not in the surplus. I want to point that out. And over 8 weeks, these individuals were resistance trained. At the end, they saw greater retention of lean mass and greater preservation of metabolic rate, or total energy expenditure, I should say. Or no, I think it actually was energy expenditure from BMR. So that's good stuff, right? So the applied outcome is there. However, if that means you as a coach just simply willy-nilly, without getting any feedback or out looking at the background of the individual or assessing how they progress with it, and have no subjective data to feedback, just give them maintenance for 2 days and then say a 30% deficit versus 25 if they had none, that can cause problems. Because and I think it's also a diagnostic tool. If the person who you're coaching binges on refeed days, you know something bad is coming when this diet's over. I think that's something to realize. So I don't think that means, okay, I just don't do refeeds, because now you're just kicking the can down the road. Something as bad is going to occur when this diet's over, and every day could be a refeed because no prep is there. There's no more contest to hold you handcuffed. So I think the most important thing when using refeeds in a bodybuilding context is that qualitatively the experience of a dieting day and a refeed day need to be the same. And this is a coaching, you have to deliver this as a coach. We still have target calories or target macros. We're still eating the same foods. We're just simply increasing the proportion of certain foods. If you have a paradigm where you're trying to keep fat low and protein the same, and maybe just carbs, if what I like in general is just overall calories come up and protein's roughly the same, then you can see a proportion of fat and carbs go up. The data, I would say, if we really want to just stick to what the research says, the study by Campbell and colleagues was higher carbs to drive that energy surplus, or rather maintenance on those high days. So you could just basically eat higher proportions of carbohydrate, but everything else is the same. And I think it's also important that it wasn't surpluses driving necessarily the deficit lower than the other days, which could create problems in training, like you said. It was simply maintenance. So that means that the deficit isn't too crazy low on those other days. And I think that's an important distinction. There are some circles in bodybuilding where they will use huge refeeds on one day and then really, really deplete the rest of the days, kind of almost like a modified UD2 approach. And I find that often causes way more problems than any potential benefit that you could get from it behaviorally, or in terms of training, or really inconsistent energy levels. And also just making the scale do stuff that makes it super hard to predict what the hell is happening. And largely, when you have it is a structure, even though it's a bipolar structure, but it's still a structure of eating that produces that kind of variation. That causes just a lot of independent stress. Seeing the scale go all over the place and not being able to gauge things, even if you've got a good coach who can look at a 2-week average and tell you that it's there, that means that only every 2 weeks when you report do you have a dose of sanity. But the rest of the time you're managing your own neuroses with seeing the scale go all over the place. So there's a lot of potential issues there. When I use refeeds in the general population, I know that's not the question, but I think this will help understand the mentality that's appropriate for them. I call refeeds and diet breaks, and anytime someone is coming out of the deficit, practicing maintenance. Because in the case of someone who is trying to lose weight, who's not a bodybuilder, the goal is almost always, or should be, if they're honest with themselves, losing the weight and keeping it off, right? And I think the mentality most people have, and that many coaches enforce with these like 12-week transformations and stuff like that, is we're going to do everything we can to optimally lose fat. And after that, I don't know, we're not working together, so I don't worry about it. But in reality, people need help maintaining fat loss. And especially first-time competitors, and you get better and better at this over time, mitigating the potential overshoot and finishing your prep at, say, 10 kilos less than you started it, but then getting up 20 kilos, that's a really common experience. And that makes the off season then become this process of cyclical mini cuts, and, mitigating that down to then say 18 kilos, 15 kilos, and eventually just finishing where you started. That's great, so long as you started at a reasonable place. So yeah, you don't want to stay shredded by any means. So it's not the same as a Gen Pop person, but you do want to have these qualities of your diet to where you can kind of shift back to quote unquote normal, and at least initially imitate what your normal behaviors were in the off season, which comes through habit formation. Like you're eating at certain meal times, you have a vegetable and a fruit and a lean protein, and then it becomes maybe a less lean protein and higher proportions of those with some added fat in the off season. And yes, you're eating in a surplus, that's great, but it's not this totally unstructured approach where there's trips to fast food places or binges that are happening. I think to help that occur, how you apply refeeds and the coaching given to it is critically important. And talking about how these are qualitatively the same as low calorie days, or these are practice maintenance periods, or these are our ability to test what peaking approach we should have, showing that they have utility. They're not just simply you get to eat, like you get to satisfy all your cravings. That's not what it is. It's not I'm living for my refeeds. And I think you want to look for that language, and you want to preempt not framing refeeds in that way initially. And that's something that I think is really, really important as a coach, or refeeds can become sometimes more problematic than they're helpful. The last thing I'll say is that if you are a coach and you're seeing one of your athletes turn refeeds into these binge triggers, that doesn't mean that the solution is stop doing refeeds. You might need to do that as well. But that is an indication to you, like I said, that you need to start doing a lot of work on framing their nutrition, taking a look at how they're dieting, what they're focused on. Like you might find that they spend all their time watching food porn, or that all they're doing is thinking about their next meal, or they're reading all these articles about fat loss. And it's like, no. You need to live a life that is not about this. You need to distract yourself. We need to choose different food items. We need to choose a different meal schedule. We need to do a lot of things to make this something more sustainable, so that they're, like a trigger can only trigger you if there is something that's like waiting, like people who don't have a post-traumatic stress experience don't get triggered by things that remind them of it, So if you're not on the edge of binging already, a refeed won't trigger you, if that is what I'm getting at. So the fact that it did doesn't mean, okay, just remove the triggers. That means that if we're going to stay with this analogy, the PTSD is still there and untreated, right? So I think what you have to do as a coach is to recognize that if this person, every time they're taken out of their normal kind of structure, goes wild, we need to help them to build more resilience, because this diet will come to an end. And that could be a really, really messy outcome if nothing is done except for maximizing fat loss.
Cliff, what's your take on refeeds here? How you like to utilize them? If you're doing anything to assess the athlete psychologically, and in how you specifically structure theirs, and if basically if you utilize these improperly, what it can do to your training.
Yeah, well, I do utilize them. I don't call them refeeds. It's sort of I think a more recent addition to the vernacular. Back when I was starting out in the late 90s, we didn't use the term refeed, but I do use them. But I'm going to explain a little bit more. I don't think that a lot of the sort of magical attributes attributed to refeeds are valid, although there might, there's going to be some effect, no doubt. Let's just look at, if you go and eat, 2,000 calories in one sitting, yeah, you're going to have an increased rate of thermogenesis, your metabolic rate's going to go up, all that kind of stuff. Does that have any functional outcome that's really going to change the game for us? If we equated that against a week in which you were sustaining the right amount of energy without refeeds. So ceteris paribus, all other things remaining equal, is there going to be any metabolic advantage to having refeeds? I really don't think there is, or if there is any effect, it's going to be pretty much, it's not going to be meaningful, right? So that begs the question, why do I apply, refeeds? It really comes down to the psyche of the athlete, and that speaks to broader things. I personally think that we have a bit of a dichotomy at the moment emerging, where there is an over-quantification in one setting and an under-quantification in another. What I mean by that is we have people who are very rigid about what they do and how they do it, and there's a backlash against that, which comes in from the more intuitive eating side and maybe the health at every size movement. The challenge there is that we can encourage restrictive eating patterns on the one hand, which are ultimately negative for long-term well-being for a whole bunch of reasons. On the other hand, we have a lot of really positive psychological, emotional, and psychosocial outcomes from intuitive eating and from, the health at every size movement. The challenge within that side is when we've looked at the longer term follow-up research on that, there are persistent psychological and emotional benefits, but there is a worsening of health status and metabolic condition. So it tells us that we need to have some middle ground. And so it's just sort of, I guess, a coincidence that within my practice, I've always framed that up in the idea that we need freedom within structure. We need certain structures that basically allow us to achieve our goals. And I think those structures need to be as lesser restrictive as possible while still getting results. So it's an educative process. But I think we also do need, for most of us, we need some freedom in which we can just say, hey, I want to have a donut, so I'm going to have it, right? So in terms of the refeeds that I talk about, it's more so having sort of windows within which people have the freedom to choose whatever they want. Supporting that, though, there needs to be a really strong focus on the counseling side of things. A lot of my clinical work has been in the mind-body field. I did my early postgrad in mind-body healthcare. A lot of what I apply is sort of drawn from that. So it's not psychology. It's more so the coaching side, I guess, of health, right? And so it's really important to look at how the person, like Eric talked about this, how the person views what they're doing. We had a really interesting discussion once upon a time when I said, oh, man, I often we'll just binge on a Friday night and get all the stuff. And Eric pulled me up on it because it's not a binge, right? If you don't feel negative about it, if you don't feel guilt and shame, it's not a binge technically. You're just eating a lot. And I really took that on board because one of the things that I often work with, with clients is their framing around things. For example, it can be subtle differences. We will use the term, having an occasional treat. Because I don't have a problem with that. I know some people say you shouldn't reward yourself with food and all that kind of stuff, but I don't think the idea of having a treat where you're giving yourself some self-love through going and getting a donut is a problem. Whereas I have found that words like cheat are more problematic because there's some implicit bias that's negative and they start to promote those feelings of guilt and shame. One client, though, here's an interesting thing. One client said, I love the word cheat. I was like, why? She came from a gaming hacker type background, and for her, a cheat is a way to get better results, right? So it was interesting how our underlying framing can change how we see these things. So basically, if someone is, there's another aspect to this. What we need to also consider is that when we remove things from a diet, people naturally want to have them more. Right, that abstinence will often drive people wanting to have it. It's not necessarily a physiological thing, but they might have that increased craving. I know that's problematic. We probably don't need to get into that because it's very nuanced. But one thing I'll often work with is the idea that a lot of what you're doing at the moment is not giving you any massive social enjoyment factor. Right? People think, oh no, I can't eat these foods. What am I going to do? And so if we discuss the idea that, you're not actually choosing things through your day for a massive amount of social enjoyment anyway, you're probably choosing them because they're there, they're easy, you're tired, you're stressed, you simply haven't thought about it. So if we can provide structures that are as easy for you to follow as possible, and a big part of that, just by the way, I think is reducing meal frequency to the minimum that will allow them to achieve their results. If we work on that educative structure through the week, then I think allowing the odd period in which people can be completely free and choose whatever they want without it being a cheat, it's just simply what they do, it's part of the process, then I think it can be really beneficial, but mostly because it's psychologically and emotionally beneficial. And within that, I'll often use a couple of different tactics as well. For example, if people do have problematic or challenges around their eating behaviors, I'll often encourage them to not actually have those windows of eating at home initially. I'll say, make it an expedition, go out, be confident about it. It doesn't matter if people see you eating a piece of cake. it doesn't mean you failed. That's basically just part of the process. Go out and be proud of it. Make it an expedition. Don't just sit at home and try and go through your cupboard and find anything that's supposedly shit food because you've got this feeding window. That's not going to be enjoyable. So it's really about maximizing experience, enjoyment, opening up the doors to wonder and possibility and making it a really positive part of the process rather than seeing it as, a guilt or shame inducing thing.
Alrighty.
All right. Well, I guess we've pretty much covered everything we had for you guys, and went down a few rabbit holes, but I really enjoyed it. I'm sure Mike really enjoyed the conversation as well, and I hope everyone that was listening got a lot out of this. So if you're interested in learning more about Eric, if you don't already know Eric, where can people find you?
Yeah, since this was a conversation about bodybuilding, I think probably the best place to go is 3dmusclejourney.com. That's the number 3 to letter D, musclejourney.com. From there, you can find our podcast, which I appreciate you guys referencing, which, we were into nearly at 150 episodes now, I think. You can also find our blogs, which, we put out relatively frequently. And also, if you want to read my books about nutrition and training, there are links there. If you want to stay up to date with research relevant to strength and physique sport, there's also a link to MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, from 3D Muscle Journey. And then the only things you can't find on that website are me doing things daily that are less interesting but more frequent on Instagram at Helms3DMJ, or my podcast with Omar Issa, where we explore the science, culture, and history of lifting at Iron Culture.
Awesome. Cool. And Cliff, I know you kind of let everyone know where to find you on our last episode, but if we have any new listeners coming here today, where can they hear and find out about you?
I'm sure given the appeal of Dr. Eric Helms, there'll be a few people listening today. But anyone can find me, just simply my name, cliffharvey.com. So if people go to cliffharvey.com, they can find links out to my various companies and all my social. They'll find links there to the Holistic Performance Institute, where we run our continuing education courses for nutrition, advanced nutrition. And Eric's actually written a very good research course for the school as well, where people can understand more about how to be a practitioner researcher.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on today, Mike, and I truly appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. I guess enjoy the week, guys. Happy Monday.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. You guys enjoy your Sunday, and thanks for having us on.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, Tim.